left for dead in the hay field. She opened her eyes to a rancher's gentle face. What if the first face you saw after waking up from near death belonged to a stranger with the gentlest eyes you've ever seen? She didn't remember how she got there, just the cold earth beneath her, the silence that stretched too long, and the sense that maybe this time no one would come. But someone did. In 1879, Wyoming, a rancher named Catton finds a woman left for dead in a hayfield. He doesn't ask questions. He simply lifts her into his arms and brings her home. What unfolds is not just a story of survival, but of healing, of slow-burning trust, and of two people quietly building something stronger than either of them expected. You'll meet a child who sees with her heart, a man who loves without needing to speak, and a woman who's learning, for the first time, that she doesn't have to run anymore. So stay with us. There's something in this story you might just see yourself in. Comment below which part of Kala's journey resonates with you the most. And if you love stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe to Quiet. The wind swept through the hayfield like it remembered something, brushing gently over a woman's body, half hidden among the bent grass. She didn't move, not a twitch, but the earth still held her warmth, and the silence around her wasn't final, it was waiting. No one knew her name. No one had seen what was done to her, but the land remembered. The wind remembered, and so did he. A rider crested the ridge, slowing not because he saw her, but because something made him stop. As if the quiet itself had spoken, he dismounted, walked to her, knelt down, looked. Then her eyes opened, not to the sky but to a man's face, weather-worn and steady. He didn't ask who she was, he simply said, "You're still here." And that was enough, not for everything to be fixed, but for something to begin, something that looked, for the first time, a little like life. He didn't carry her like someone saving a life. He carried her like someone refusing to leave it behind. Catton didn't rush. The horse moved slow beneath them. Her weight was fragile in his arms, and though he'd seen death before, this felt different, like something still tethered to the world by one last, fraying thread. When they reached his cabin, the air inside was cool and still, the kind that settles over a place built with hands, not blueprints. He laid her on the cot near the window, where the light softened instead of exposed. There were no prayers, no declarations, just water drawn from the basin and a cloth pressed gently to her skin. He didn't ask what happened, didn't touch the bruises with questions. He simply worked, quiet, sure, steady, as if keeping her alive was a thing the earth had handed to him, and he wasn't going to let it fall. Later, a soft knock at the door. Bria peeked in, barefoot and holding a chipped bowl. "Does she like stew?" Well, the girl asked, not with fear but curiosity. "She hasn't said much," Catton answered. Bria stepped inside anyway. "I'll just leave it here. She might be hungry when she wakes up again." It wasn't a grand rescue. No dramatic declarations or second chances promised. It was quieter than that. Kala didn't speak for 2 days. Her eyes stayed half-closed, scanning the beams above her head as if waiting for them to crack. But each morning the bowl was refilled. Each evening a clean cloth waited beside her pillow. And just outside, a man kept working the land as if something inside him had changed. No one said the word safe. But for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like prey. And in that stillness, in the way her breath didn't catch when the door opened, something slowly returned. Not hope, not yet. There were mornings when Calla moved like smoke, quiet, curling around the edges of rooms she didn't yet believe she belonged in. She kept her back to the walls, watched the corners. Her hands, though healing, trembled when she poured water into a cup, not because of weakness, but memory. Catton noticed, but he never reached too far. Instead, he slid a glass toward her one evening and placed it just close enough to the lantern so that the soft light caught the thin scar along her forearm. He didn't stare, he didn't speak, just waited as if letting the silence stretch long enough might make it gentler. Calla didn't explain, but she didn't pull her arm away either. Bria, as always, moved with the kind of honesty only children have. One day, she shuffled into the room with a folded piece of paper and placed it on Calla's lap. "It's us," she said proudly. "You, Uncle Catton, and me. That's our house. See, the chimney has smoke. That means someone's cooking." Calla blinked down at the crooked lines, the child's scrawl. A home. Her inside it. She hadn't realized how much she missed being drawn into someone's world until someone, small and certain, put her right in the middle of theirs. That night, unable to sleep, she sat near the fire. Her feet curled beneath her, eyes fixed on the flicker. Catton walked in from outside, smelling faintly of dust and wood smoke. He didn't speak, just nodded at the extra log she'd placed to keep the fire alive. After a long silence, she asked, "Why'd you save me?" He looked at her, not startled, not defensive. "I didn't think about it," he said, voice low. "I just couldn't leave you." There were no vows made, no tears shed, but something in the space between them shifted, not enough to close the distance. And the first time she tried walking the length of the porch, her knees buckled halfway through. She caught herself on the railing, jaw clenched, breath sharp. But when she straightened again, there was something different in her eyes, not pain but defiance. She didn't want to be rescued. Not anymore. A week later, she stepped out while Catton was sorting planks by the corral. He looked up once, the sun catching the edge of his brow, but didn't ask why she was there. "I want to help," she said. "I can't sit inside any longer." He didn't speak, just reached into the crate beside him and held out a pair of worn gloves, bigger than her hands but thick enough to shield her skin. She slipped them on. He handed her a hammer, and just like that they began. The work was slow. Some days her strength gave out before the nails did, but she showed up each morning, boots scuffing the dirt, eyes scanning the field like she'd known it her whole life. Catton didn't praise her, didn't guide her every move. He simply worked beside her, plank by plank, until the fence began to take shape. Sometimes their hands brushed as they lifted the heavier boards. Sometimes they didn't speak for hours. But silence with him wasn't empty. It was filled with the rustle of wind in the grass, the creak of wood settling into place, the soft clink of tools being passed back and forth. Trust, it turned out, didn't have to be declared. It could be built the way fences were, slow, steady, post by post. That evening, as they packed up, Calla leaned against the fence line, breathless but calm. Catton stood beside her, arms folded, gaze on the sky shifting into dusk. "You know," he said quietly, When your eyes opened in that field, I haven't been the same. The rain had passed, leaving the porch damp and the air smelling of earth and pine. They sat in silence beneath the overhang, the two of them side by side but not touching. Calla's shoulders trembled, not from cold but from something older. A memory that still lived in her skin, waiting for quiet moments like this to surface. Her fingers were laced together in her lap, white-knuckled. Catton didn't ask. Instead, he took the old blanket from the bench behind him and draped it around her shoulders. When she flinched, he didn't pull away. He just rested a hand gently on her arm, not to steady her, but to remind her, without words, that she wasn't alone. The sun was low now, slipping behind the ridge. Shadows stretched long, and the quiet between them grew heavier. "I used to have things," she said finally, her voice thin. "A home, a name that meant something, people who said they'd never leave, and one by one they did." Her eyes didn't meet his, but they didn't need to. "I don't want anything from you," he said softly. "I don't take, I choose." She looked at him then, not startled but searching. Something in her face eased, as if his words had reached the part of her still bracing for the worst. And then, without warning, without ceremony, he leaned in and kissed her. Not a kiss that demanded or declared. It wasn't hot like fire or desperate like longing. It was quiet, warm, the way the first morning sun feels after a bitter winter, gentle enough not to burn, strong enough to stay. When he pulled back, he didn't ask for anything. He didn't explain. Calla didn't speak either. But her hand found his, fingers interlacing like they'd been there before. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel afraid. No one told her when she belonged. There was no announcement, no shift in tone, no symbolic gesture. Just a slow accumulation of moments, ordinary, quiet, and completely hers. Calla began waking before the sky turned blue. Not out of duty, but from a desire to move purposefully, deliberately. The cabin, once a space she tiptoed through, now creaked beneath her footsteps with a kind of welcome. She stirred the embers in the hearth, sliced bread with the dull knife Catton hadn't sharpened in weeks, and opened the coop door before the hens began to cluck. By the time Catton rose, she had already gathered eggs, washed the basin, and left the kitchen filled with the scent of something warm. "Early bird," he muttered one morning, scratching at his beard. "Someone had to feed the real ones," she replied, eyes flicking toward the clucking in the yard. He smiled just slightly. When she offered to join him in the field, he didn't argue. He simply handed her the second pair of gloves, worn soft with time, and led the way. The land didn't make it easy. The soil was stubborn, packed down by years of hard seasons. But Calla found satisfaction in the ache of her muscles, the stretch of her spine, the sting in her palms. It wasn't about proving herself. It was about feeling her weight in the world again. Bria noticed it, too. One afternoon, as Calla dug a row for beans, Bria plopped down beside her with a tiny tin pail and a handful of mismatched seeds. "Can I help?" she asked. Calla looked over, dirt smudged on her cheek. "You sure you want to?" Bria grinned. "Only if I get to plant mine right next to yours." That evening, while they sat shelling peas on the porch, Catton spoke, not looking up from his work. "My brother, he got sick one spring. Fever took him fast. I didn't know what to do except bury him under the old bluff. Took me a season to dig through that rocky soil. Another to stop thinking it was my fault." The words landed softly, like worn stones dropped into a still pond. Calla didn't reply. She didn't need to. She simply reached over and laid a folded napkin in his lap. The next night, she cooked lentil soup, thick and earthy, with rosemary just the way he'd once mentioned, and vinegar swirled in at the end to cut the weight. Catton didn't say a word when he tasted it, but he finished every spoonful. And after the meal, as she washed dishes at the basin, he leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "You've got a steadier hand than most men I've hired," he said. She froze, not because she doubted him, but because the words landed in a place she didn't know was waiting. It wasn't praise. It wasn't courtesy. It was recognition. Calla had been many things before, discarded, dismissed, made invisible. But here, with dirt beneath her nails and steam rising from her soup pot, she was seen. Not as a guest, not as a survivor, but as a woman who stayed. Snow hadn't fallen yet, but the air carried a certain warning, the kind that slips in beneath the doorframe before winter fully arrives. Calla was pouring tea when Bria, seated cross-legged on the floor with a threadbare doll in her lap, looked up and asked the kind of question only children ask plainly. "Will you still be here when the snow comes?" The words caught in Calla's throat. Her hand stilled, hovering above the cup. She hadn't thought that far ahead, not out loud, not even to herself. But the way Bria looked at her, hopeful, not pleading, made something soften. "If you want me to," she said quietly. Bria nodded as if the matter was settled. But Catton, who'd been quietly stacking firewood outside, stepped into the doorway. His gaze held hers across the room. Not a smile, not a question. "I do," he said simply. "I want you here." There was no grand proposal, no ring wrapped in ribbon or speech rehearsed in the barn. Just a shared meal that night, potatoes, roast chicken, and buttered bread. Bria chattered about frost on the windows, about how she once tried to catch snowflakes on her tongue, and how this time maybe Calla could try it too. After dinner, Calla cleared the plates, and Catton helped dry them. Their hands moved in quiet rhythm, two people no longer circling each other, but orbiting something they'd begun to build. When she turned to put away the last dish, he placed a hand on her shoulder, steady, unassuming, his voice low. "This is your home now." That was it. No music, no announcement. But the stillness that followed was fuller than any ceremony. The next morning, Me showed up early, carrying a folded square of fabric. "It was our mother, S," she said, laying the old linen tablecloth gently on the wooden table. "She saved it for something that mattered. I think this qualifies." Calla ran her fingers over the embroidered edge. Faint sunflowers, worn pale with time, not fancy, but cared for. She didn't cry. She didn't need to. Because every gesture since she arrived, the mendied coat draped on the chair, the second cup set beside hers, the shoes dried by the fire, had already spoken louder than vows. No one used the word married. There was no preacher, no paper signed. But when Bria came running in from outside with a fistful of frost-bitten leaves and shouted, "Mama Calla, look what I found," no one corrected her. Calla knelt, took the leaves in her hands, and said, "Those are beautiful, sweetheart." And behind her, Catelyn leaned against the door frame, arms crossed, as if the sight of her, was the answer to a question he hadn't known he'd been asking. Some promises don't need rings. They're written in the warmth of shared mornings, in the softness of steady eyes, in the quiet decision to stay, when leaving used to feel easier. The wagon creaked over the familiar dirt path, wheels grinding softly against gravel that once marked escape but now felt like return. Calla hadn't seen the town since. Before. Before the field, before the blood, before she'd learned the shape of her name spoken gently by someone who wasn't trying to leave. She didn't know what to expect. The storefronts were the same. Weathered paint. A rusted bell above the door of the dry goods shop. A dog asleep on the porch of the barber's. But no one stared. No whispers trailed behind her boots. In fact, most didn't look twice until she stepped inside the shop for coffee beans, and the woman behind the counter paused mid-count. "You look different," the shopkeeper said, not suspicious, not startled, just noticing. "Healthier." Calla offered a small nod, unsure what else to give. "You found a place, didn't you?" The woman added, eyes soft. Calla hesitated, then smiled. "Yes, I did." Outside, the wind had picked up slightly, pulling at her shawl. Catelyn waited beside the wagon, arms crossed, gaze steady. As they started back, walking side by side, she exhaled like it was the first full breath she'd taken in years. "I never thought I'd come back," she said, eyes on the road. "You're not coming back," Catelyn replied. "You're moving forward." She looked over at him. He didn't say it with flair or finality. He just meant it. They didn't hold hands. They didn't need to. Their steps fell in rhythm, quiet and even, like they had all the time in the world. As the roof of the cabin came into view, Bria's voice rang out before they could even call her name. "She's back." The girl shouted, barefoot and grinning, arms flung wide as she ran toward them. "Mama Calla's back." Calla froze for half a heartbeat. She'd never asked Bria to call her that. No one had, it just happened. And for the first time she didn't correct it, didn't flinch, didn't look to Catelyn for permission. She simply knelt, caught Bria in her arms, and whispered, "Yes, sweetheart, I'm home." And when she stood, Catelyn was already there beside her, silent, solid, certain. Not just a man who once saved her life, but the one walking beside her as she started to live it. The days no longer felt borrowed. They belonged to them now, Calla, Catelyn, Bria, stitched together in the kind of rhythm that doesn't announce itself, but settles into the bones like a familiar song. Calla began keeping the ledgers. Catelyn taught her how to track expenses, balance grain orders, calculate feed. At first, the numbers danced mockingly on the page, but day by day, the lines grew steady beneath her hand. She wasn't just learning how to read a ledger. She was learning to see herself as part of what was being built. Outside, Catelyn repaired the barn roof. He worked with sleeves rolled high, sweat streaking his arms, boots caked in dry earth. He didn't ask for help, but Calla brought him water anyway and stayed to hold the ladder. Bria had taken to planting things, wildflowers mostly, along the porch where the sun hit in the mornings. "So we have color," she said. "So we look like we're happy." And they were. No one talked about tomorrow. There were no plans drawn in ink, no promises written on paper. Just meals shared, chores done together, laughter that came easily now, and silence that no longer felt heavy. Calla still had her ghosts. Some nights when the wind shifted just so, she would flinch at sounds that weren't threats. But she didn't run. Not anymore. Instead, she told stories. At first, just to Bria, softly by lantern light, her voice careful around the edges of old wounds. She didn't speak for sympathy. She spoke for truth. "I used to think I was broken," she said one night, brushing Bria's hair with fingers now firm but kind. "But maybe I was just waiting to be heard." Bria blinked up at her, wide-eyed. "Does that mean I'm strong too?" Calla smiled. "It means you're strong because you listen." Later that week, after dinner, Bria crawled into Calla's lap and tucked her head under her chin. "I'm okay," she whispered, "because you're here." Calla didn't answer. She just held her tighter. Outside, Catelyn was oiling the hinges on the barn door. The dog barked once at a bird and settled again. Inside, the fire crackled. The plates were clean. The windows fogged from the soup they'd made together. And in the hush that followed, no one felt the need to speak. Not because there wasn't anything left to say, but because everything worth saying was already there. In the way the house held its warmth. In the way three shadows moved as one. Calla's life didn't begin the day she was left in the field, and it didn't end when she was carried out of it. It continued, in the way she rinsed her hands after working the soil, in the quiet dinners shared without needing to fill the silence, in the small weight of Bria's head resting against her shoulder as dusk settled. Healing, she learned, didn't arrive like thunder. It came in the form of not being asked to leave, of being looked at and stayed with. Some people search their whole lives for a grand reason to begin again. But sometimes all it takes is one steady presence, one quiet man who chose not to turn away, and in a world too quick to forget, that gentle choice was enough to build a life worth staying for. What we carry forward isn't always what we planned, but sometimes it's exactly what we needed. Calla's journey wasn't about starting over. It was about learning that healing can be quiet, that love doesn't have to be loud, and that sometimes being chosen, not saved, is what truly changes us. If there was a moment in Calla's story that caught you off guard, moved you deeply, or left you thinking, share it in the comments. What part of her journey did you feel the most? And if stories like this speak to you, if you believe in the power of small kindnesses and second chances, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Quiet West for more tales like this one. As the fire fades and the porch grows quiet, ask yourself, when was the last time someone stayed, not because they had to, but because they wanted to?